Who would have thought that a little opaque piece of glass could cause so much confusion? Let's clear all of that up right now. That sun keeps coming in and out of the clouds. I'll just tweak this variable ND filter I have on the camera, just adjust my exposure. Yep, we are ND filter fans. We use them all the time, but spoiler alert, they are a little bit tricky to use on this GoPro Hero 8. You need to be very, very careful because the Hyperlapse 2.0 does not work well with ND filters. ND Filters 101. It is an opaque piece of glass that lets you get your shutter speed down to double the frame rate that you are shooting at, thereby allowing you to achieve the motion blur that the eye is accustomed to when looking at cinematic footage. Lots of inverted commas you will notice. ND filters do not give you more saturated, vibrant colours. They do not allow you to point the camera at the sun and get a nice balanced exposure between the sky and the ground. They do none of that. All they are is an extra lever to pull to allow you to adjust the exposure of your GoPro. If there is motion in your shot, you want it to look as lifelike as possible. We are trying to depict reality with our little cameras, after all. Now, when a car shoots past you in a street, can you read the numbers on the number plate? No, you cannot. It's blurred. There's motion blur. That is what your eye is accustomed to seeing. That is how we see the world. So we want to depict that as best we can with our cameras. If we leave this thing on auto on a bright day like today, this will be shooting on 1/1000th of a second shutter speed. Every single frame is pin sharp. There's no motion blur whatsoever. If on the other hand, let's say we're doing real-time footage at 25 frames per second, then we shoot on a 1/50th of a second shutter speed, the inverse of double the frame rate, then we get that motion blur in between each of the 25 frames per second, giving us a cinematic look that we are used to seeing in real life when we open our eyes. So Stuart, why do we even need ND filters? Well, on a normal camera like this GoPro Hero 8, we have three ways of controlling our exposure. Let's talk about the aperture, the iris on the camera, the hole in the center that lets the amount of light in towards the sensor. Here it's fixed at f2.8, and at the end of the day, that has nothing to do with motion blur anyway. That controls depth of field. Then we have ISO, the sensitivity of the sensor to light. By and large, you always want to shoot on the lowest ISO possible because the higher the ISO, the more noise and grain there is in the image. Again, nothing to do with motion blur. The third way of controlling exposure is shutter speed. Now think about it, we have a fixed aperture f2.8, we have a fixed ISO 100. Switch this camera on and put your 1/50th of a second shutter, it will be far too bright. There's nothing else that we can do in camera to bring the exposure of the image down. That 1/50th of a second shutter is bringing far too much light into the camera, which is why, whoops, don't drop it, which is why we need to put a little pair of sunglasses on our lens to cut the light down even further. The fourth way of controlling light getting to the sensor. Motion normally occurs in two ways. First of all, you can have things happening within your frame. So someone running past, a car going past, animal, whatever it is. That's motion. You might want some motion blur on that. Second of all, the movement of the camera itself, especially on these wide angles around the edge of the frame, you're going to have a lot of motion and you might want to see that motion blur. As I indicated, we have an ND filter on this camera as we speak. So if I do this, my hand is a little bit blurred. It looks cinematic. Polar Pro have this really smart system for the GoPro 8 where you clip on this little mount essentially, and then these ND filters are magnetic and you can switch them out. I absolutely love it, but I want to come back to this huge caveat that I'm not seeing talked about very much in the context of the GoPro 8. If you're using hypersmooth image stabilization, which I think you should because it allows you to do these lovely dolly moves, little gimbal moves, you cannot use these ND filters. It's not the fault of the ND filters, it's the fact that the hypersmooth requires clear, crisp images so that they can match all those images and reposition them and create a stabilized image. If there's motion blur, it has trouble doing that and the end result is not satisfactory. That hypersmooth simply does not work with lower shutter speeds. This is a massive caveat that you have to be aware of if you're thinking of buying these Polar Pro ND filters for the GoPro 8. Now, as I say, this has nothing to do with the Polar Pro ND filter. It has everything to do with the way in which the electronic stabilization works. So, if you think you can use this without electronic stabilization, then absolutely get these ND filters. Now, think about it. You can put this on a tripod and just use it in a traditional way, but you can also use this with mechanical stabilization, so a little gimbal. And I'd recommend you get one anyway, because much as the hypersmooth is absolutely amazing I don't think it's a full substitute for a mechanical gimbal. So there's my 2 cents on ND filters for the GoPro Hero 8. If you are a vlogger, run and gun, then you don't need them. You just want a camera that you can switch on, swing about, and it just gets you a good result either way. But if you're looking for cinematic results from this, then absolutely get yourself some ND filters. There's a link in the description below. Okay, any questions, please leave them in the comments below, and we will see you next time.